Hello, friends. I'm Sarah from Dandelion Seeds Positive Parenting, and excuse the lighting. It is dark here right now, so doing the best I can with artificial lighting. I get this question sometimes, so thought I would give you a short video about it. What do I do when I know I'm going into a historically stressful situation? And I know from past experience that after the situation, I'm going to have very little patience. I may be more prone to yelling or taking out my stress on my children. And I don't want to do that. And yet, no matter what I do, I can't seem to break the habit. I go in stressed and I come out stressed. And no matter what, it's the same thing over and over. What do I do here? Well, this is a really good question. Number one, if you are already aware that you're going into a potentially triggering situation, this is perhaps the most important knowledge you can have. Because when we know, hey, I'm going to be triggered, there are some things we can do proactively to calm ourselves down and change the outcome so we're not repeating the patterns that aren't serving us or our families. First thing we can do is we can spend some time visualizing. Perhaps we journal it, perhaps we meditate or pray about it. We find some way to get very, very specific about what we want our response to be, what we want our new pattern to be. And I'm not saying be general, like, oh, I want to be nicer, or I don't want to stress out so much, or I don't want to do whatever. We don't learn in negatives, as I've said before, we learn in positives. What I want to do is this thing, this very, very specific thing. So it still can't be something like, I want to be nicer, because what does that look like? Nobody knows what that really looks like until they see it. Well, what do they see? Maybe it means, you know what, when my child is just doing their normal kid things that don't typically bother me, but after I go into the situation, I know that they do bother me. Here's what I want to do. I want to, perhaps I'll give myself some nervous system input. Maybe I'll give myself a big bear hug. Maybe I'll take some deep belly breaths, something calming. Maybe I'll do some tapping, which once again is proven by science to be valid and a legitimate way to calm down when we're stressed. Try out your things. Maybe it's, I'm going to get a change of scenery. I'm going to do something that's out of the ordinary, but you picture the details of what you do want to do, because here's something fascinating about brain science. The more detail we can picture, the more we actually start to create new neural pathways, as if the new pattern is already our reality. Pretty interesting, isn't it? So obviously, the more we practice this mentally, and of course, the more we practice it in reality, in real life, the easier the new pattern becomes. Well, what happens if it's still hard? What happens if, even if we've tried these things, they still don't seem to work every time or all that well? Here's my best advice to you in this scenario. Change your pattern entirely and be so 100% proactive about creating a joyful situation. So if your pattern is, and I'm going to make something up here, if your pattern is, you know what, I know that every time I go to my in-laws' house, I get stressed, and then afterwards we go home and I'm not the parent I want to be. Well, guess what? You might not be able to get out of going to your in-laws' house, but you might say, you know what, today afterwards, we're not going to go straight home. What's something that brings me joy that we can go do that's going to change up the routine? Because when we change up the routine out here, we also change up the routine in here and in here. We change our patterns by very literally changing our pattern. Well, what happens then if, oh, but I can't go do something else because by the time we get home, it's bedtime and I have to, finish doing all these things or whatever. Well, then explore which parts of your pattern can you change. Perhaps you don't need to be doing this thing, be it visiting the in-laws or whatever it is. Maybe you move that up to earlier in the day so that you have the ability to change more of your pattern. So find some way to very, very consciously create something joyful that you know you are doing for yourself to bring yourself joy. It triggers the reward centers in the brain because you know you get the anticipation of looking forward to this thing after the triggering event. But when you actually give yourself that thing to which you have been looking forward, as I mentioned, the reward centers of the brain say, yes, this feels good, this feels right. And your body releases happy chemicals like dopamine and oxytocin and all sorts of things that help get us into a calmer state with ourselves, with our children. There are another couple of things you can do as well. One is if you are open to physical touch, and not everybody is, particularly after a triggering situation, but do things that trigger the release of that oxytocin. So this is a chemical or a hormone in the body that essentially we feel when we are hugging, when we are kissing, when we are having intimate relations with someone, when we are breastfeeding, if we're breastfeeding a child. There are lots of things that can trigger oxytocin. It's that feel-good feeling that you get after these things, and they're all triggered by touch. If touch isn't your thing, find something else. And last but not least, my final point to you is, as once again, you've heard me mention them in many, many of my videos, Daniel J. Siegel and Tina Payne Bryson, two experts in this field of positive psychology and interpersonal neurobiology, and many of the other fields in which they're experts, they talk about name it to frame it. Name what you're feeling. Don't try to talk yourself out of feeling whatever trigger, whatever anger, whatever sadness, whatever big feeling you're feeling, because oftentimes the more we fight against it, the more strongly it's going to attempt to show up. And that can feel downright horrible, because just that thing you're trying not to do is the very thing you'll end up doing even more than if you had just let it flow. So what if you say, you know what, when I come out of this situation, I'm really mad, I'm really tense, I'm really anxious, fill in the blank with whatever your feeling is. And you know what, I'm going to lean into this feeling rather than getting out of it. And what happens when I lean into it, when I feel that thing, when I feel that uncomfortable feeling that's really hard for me after this triggering event, how can I express this feeling in ways that do no harm? So for example, let's say it's anger, let's say it's stress, let's say it's anxiety, something like that. What are some ways that I can release this that don't involve yelling at my children or lashing out at my partner or whatever it is? Maybe I turn on some loud music and I dance it out. Maybe I do something just to move my body. Maybe I go outside in nature and go for a run. Maybe I do something that engages the body or engages the mind. Maybe I journal, maybe I do some of the other things I talked about, but I find some way to create a positive, healthy outlet, not running from the feeling, but instead leaning into the feeling, taking the feeling as a messenger and saying, all right, feeling, I know you're here to tell me that I'm uncomfortable with that situation that I knew I'd be uncomfortable with. And you know what? I was right about that. And here are the productive ways that I'm going to handle that this time. And you know what? If you don't do it perfectly this time or next time or the time after, that's okay. Give yourself grace. Nobody does this perfectly every single time. We all have our triggers, and that's part of what makes us human. But the more you practice healthy coping strategies, including leaning into the feelings and figuring out what it is that you need to feel peaceful, and being very, very specific and proactive about creating that sense of peace, the more joy and comfort you will allow into the situation, even if it is inherently stressful. Hope this helps, and I'll see you again soon.